the summit opened just a few days ago. It ends next week. What's the main theme this year, Suleiman? And what's been the greatest expectation around what people want to see happen this time around?
Thank you very much for having me. So very, very straightforward. The theme for COP27 in Egypt is Together Towards Implementation. And as it implies, what it essentially means is that none of the work that requires to be done to achieve net zero and address the climate catastrophe that we're dealing with can be done by just one person or a single organization or a single company or a nation. And that is why I think, because going back to what the UN Secretary General mentioned, we do not have the time. It's only 8 years between now and 2030. And that's why for us at RMI, we believe that the conceptual stage for energy transition is actually over. And we need to sort of all agree that time is running against us and we need a radical implementation kind of approach to achieve those targets. So that is the expectation. And that is what we want to, that is what we are gearing towards.
Now, there are some big asks and expectations of wealthier nations, the world's most industrialized nations, to make right, do right by the rest of the world. What is actually drawing wealthy nations to these kinds of summits? I mean, what's the incentive for them? And then what's drawing less wealthy nations, especially those in African countries?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think fundamentally we need to be able to have a realignment between global finance and development. Energy, climate, and development must go hand in hand. This means that we have to strike a balance between historical responsibilities of wealthy nations that have made the most contribution to this crisis and the development needs for the less wealthy nations. So as we're seeing wealthy nations, who have the historical responsibility, we have seen them make commitments to assist poorer countries in providing financial support towards their energy transition. We're also seeing, on the other hand, less wealthy nations taking steps towards, launching their own energy transition plans. So we can see, for example, Nigeria back in August launched its energy transition plan. And yesterday, we also witnessed Ghana, the president of Ghana was here to launch the Ghanaian sort of their energy transition plan. So there is supposed to be that kind of striking that balance. And right now, what African countries are demanding is action, beyond the commitments, beyond the promises, and beyond sort of the pledges that have been done to be able to achieve net zero and the energy transition pathways.
Yeah, because there is that chasm between making commitments and then actually making good on those commitments and then actually implementing what's being asked and decided here. How realistic are the hopes that wealthy nations who are the biggest polluters will actually pay for the loss and damage that their industrialization has caused and brought us to the point where we are in this climate crisis? I mean, a lot of countries are facing economic problems on the domestic front. So where does this then fall in terms of their priorities about where they will spend their money?
Yeah, I think what is very encouraging is to see that finally an agenda item on this matter has been included in building up from COP26 in Glasgow. So this is the first time, we're seeing loss and damage funding being part of the conversation and official negotiations. And even before, COP27, we've seen countries like Denmark taking the lead and becoming the first government to kind of propose funding that is devoted to loss and damage with about $13 million commitment. And we've also seen pledges from other countries like Scotland and Wallonia of Belgium. Now, this is definitely a step in the right direction because, again, like I said, this has to go hand in hand with the conversation that we're having with energy access, with energy transition.
Suleiman, there's this talk about reparations. I know that's what a lot of Africa's young climate activists want from the wealthy nations. And at the same time, there is this talk around helping finance countries to get them to, especially lower income countries, to help make the transition to clean energy. What's the greater priority here? Or can both be accomplished at the same time?
Yeah, I think if you would ask me, I would say it's not one or the other, but both, right? If you look at the millions that, of losses and damage funding kind of rich nations are starting to put right now on the table, and contrast it with the billions needed to sort of address the cost of floods in poorer nations. I come from Nigeria, and in the Niger Delta of Nigeria today, we're experiencing the catastrophic kind of effects of climate change and flooding. It's the same in Pakistan. It's the same in St. Lucia, so that there needs to be also a balance there. So that repatriation needs to take place in parallel with the amount of investment that is required for, poorer nations to transition out of fossil fuels, for example, towards a just and equitable energy transition.
Suleiman, very briefly, are African nations speaking with one voice as a regional bloc at these summits? I mean, African countries have different interests. They suffer from different types of consequences from the climate crisis. But are we speaking as one voice at summits like these?
Yeah, to a certain extent, you can say that, in the sense that when you look at the statistics, right, there's 600 million Africans that lack access to electricity, close to another 1 billion people that lack access to clean cooking. And if you look at the current kind of annual climate finance flows into Africa, which is barely about 30 to 40 billion, developed countries need to keep their promise, right, of providing that finance. So this particular COP is so essential that in COP27 that we're shifting away from, unfulfilled pledges to radical implementation. And that is kind of the African narrative, one that highlights both the benefits of energy transition as well as putting the people first in terms of energy access and development.
Are you hopeful that Africans will leave this summit feeling optimistic, feeling that, they have been heard and that promises will be kept? Very briefly.
I am quite hopeful, but it takes a lot of, commitment and collaboration that needs to happen for, to be able to address these issues. But I'm quite hopeful because this is the COP for Africa.
Okay, Suleiman, I will remain hopeful with you. Suleiman Babamanu from RMI, thank you so much for speaking to us from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. I do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me.